You know, the Penan, the nomadic people in Sarawak, many of them, they come to town when they're very, very sick. When they die, they have no relative, they have no friends there. And for some reason or other, in the hospital, they knew my father was around, that he would care for these people. He would get a call from the hospital and say, there's a Penan here, and he's just died. We don't know what to do with his body. He would go to the hospital, pick the dead body of this Penan and put it in his car. And
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Dad, it's just the two of us again today after a string of having guests. And I think it would be really good following our episode with Tan Sri Jamila last week, which I was personally both encouraged but also very challenged by, to really talk about this idea of leadership as service. I think so often people think that leadership is about authority and therefore it is power over. But, often actually the real posture of a great leader is one of a servant first. Biblically as well, it says in Matthew 20 verse 26, whoever wants to be great among you must first be your servant. This might seem a little bit countercultural to a few. So, why is servant leadership a thing and how does it work in our favor?
I consider, Leon, service as the X factor in leadership. And the reason why I say that is just when you think about it, it sounds like a rather mundane word to connect and call it an X factor. The reason why I say that is this. Although it's so mundane, it opens a window into a new dimension. It's new dimension that will provide the leadership, I call it the X factor, that allow the person to then take a new posture, a new perspective that is greater than themselves and a new pattern of actions and behavior. So if you have a new posture, a new perspective, a new pattern for actions and behavior that embodies what we call servant leadership, that is actually something that is completely, entirely new, almost like a left field example. And we're going to unpack this idea later on as we discuss it. And the reason why I say right up front is to demonstrate that it is the X factor in leadership, the ultimate. If you can embody this, you can progress many ways. But if you get down to the level of behaving like a servant in leadership, that's the X factor.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of defined the fact that it's an X factor, I think the first point of servant leadership, which is ultimately that as leaders, we need to first and foremost be of service to the mission. Now, we've talked many times in this podcast about this thing that we call the true north.
Yes.
But having a sense of mission that is greater than yourself. And I think when you have that naturally already puts you in a bit of a posture of a servant. Because in all the things that you do, you're not doing things to build your own empire, but you're doing things to serve a bigger mission. And a bigger mission that will go on to serve other people as well. So let's talk a little bit about serving the mission. Why is a mission... I almost said, why is the mission impossible? Why is the mission important in the things that we do?
You and I kick off this podcast with rule number 1. That was the very first episode. We talked about the game of the impossible. We gave the example of Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew is a clear example when he led Singapore. It was a mission for him. Everybody who watched Lee Kuan Yew, the episodes on YouTube, he cried on the day that Singapore was kicked out from Malaysia. Because to him, that mission was an impossibility. It was larger than himself. And many years today, we all know that Lee Kuan Yew has led his country from a tiny city-state and transformed it into a global powerhouse. It is a global powerhouse. And the mission they set for himself was to create a prosperous nation out of a single idea. This idea, the True North, was to become a regional and global hub, a hub for logistics, a hub for finance, and a hub for trading. And there was a single mission that he put forward. It was considered a game of impossible. That's why when he cried on television, and it's the famous cut that people always refer to, he knew it was a game of impossible. It was much larger than himself. That was the mission that he put as an example there. I have another example, if you like, Leon. In the year 1970, during the Vietnam War, there's Captain Andrew Lewoski. He led his team and sacrificed himself and died in the mission during the war, the Vietnam War. And this is, I want to quote one comment from one of the guys that he led at the time. He led them during the war and he died. I had 4 captains in my year. You were by far the best and most loved by your fellow infantrymen. We were on that patrol outside Van Trung. We went into that abandoned Viet Cong village. You always took the lead for us. I was just 10 guys behind you when the explosion came. It could have been any of us. We all hoped and knew the outcome. And the guy died. And what he was referring was, Captain Andrew Lewoski was right in front. And every one of his soldiers were behind. The guy who was relating the story was number 10 behind. And everybody knew at the time there were a lot of bombs that were planted by the Viet Congs to make sure they are protected. And yet the guy was prepared to put himself. This was the mission, larger than himself. That's a classic example. Martin Luther King is a civil rights leader that took the mission and actually sacrificed himself. So when you talk about service as a mission larger than himself, you can understand why I mean this to be the X factor.
Yep. And when you have a mission that is larger than yourself and one that you are so compelled by, I think these are the things that can drive people like, Tan Sri Jamila, who we interviewed the week prior, to be able to do the same, to be able to put her own life on the line in order to serve a greater mission. Her own sort of game of impossible, if you like, not just for herself, but for humanity. Let's now talk about, you mentioned teams earlier. I think the second component of then service is if we have a sense of service and duty to the mission and the sense of duty to that mission then helps us to have a greater posture of service towards our teams. And so, maybe we can talk now about what does this look like? How do we be then both leaders but also servants to our teams as well?
Yeah, that is a very important thing. So when people work for you, visibly see that your behavior is one that exhibits the X factor because you're doing it for the team, it becomes a very rousing thing for the team. I remember clearly when I was in Shell MDS Bintulu, at the time when they decided to buy all the iPod that was in Kuala Lumpur to demonstrate and pay and give it to every staff in Bintulu, and including the ones in Kuala Lumpur. There were more than 300 staff, including our tea lady, including the security guard. Everybody had the iPod. It was a demonstration to them that me as a leader in the organization was prepared to recognize every single one of them and making sure that they get visibly rewarded and appreciated for it. At the time, when Apple released iPod, it was the object of desire. Everybody wanted it. And because it was just newly released, it was such a huge jubilation amongst the team. And if you have to do something that show and demonstrate that you are providing service in your leadership, do something even as simple as that. It will go a long way to actually demonstrate to your team that's a behavior that you want to exhibit. And all the other things that we were doing, and they all realized that I was stepping behind. When we were running the labs, I was not the guy charging out there telling them I know the answers. I was clearly telling them, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know the answers to how we fix the business. I'm only provide a framework and leadership approach. But really the answers must come from you. And we will do everything to make sure that your solutions that you put forward will get implemented.
I think this is an interesting one to note because some might say, well, isn't this being overly soft as a leader? Isn't the role of the leader also to kind of chart the way forward, to stand in the future, as you say, in order to lead your team towards a promised land? But, I think there is a distinction to be made here because even in our very own methodology, in our consulting firm, PEMANDU Associates, we make it very clear that at the level of setting mission or
Right.
setting the true north, that is actually something that is the role of the leader or the leadership team. And we make sure that that is the leadership team, because in order for people to know that they have, in order for people to feel convinced to join you on that journey, you've got to first set the direction. So that's fair. That is the role of the leader. But I think what you've just mentioned here is, if the why is defined by the leader, actually when it comes to the how, this is where you need to involve people and give them a sense of ownership in the things that they're doing. And this, in a sense, is a form of servant leadership.
Absolutely.
You've set a direction earlier on, but you're now taking on the posture of service by saying, you know what, we recognize and we value your contributions and your different skill sets. And now we want to invite you to the table to think of how we begin to chart forward. So I think that is a posture of leadership. And I think along the way as well, back to that point, to maybe counter the thinking of, well, isn't this being a bit too soft? I would also think that in order to serve is ultimately to want to see your teams do better. And sometimes that doesn't always mean encouraging. Sometimes that also means admonishing where appropriate as well. But the caveat here is that you want to admonish with the intent of caring for them, with the intent of wanting them to be better. And that's why for us, we think that, coaching and mentoring is the other mark of a servant leader.
Absolutely.
A servant leader who's intentional about celebrating the wins, but in equal measure, providing correction and steer as well, if we feel that our teams maybe have not been doing so well, And so I think these sorts of coaching conversations are very important. So one of the things that we practice is, for every time we do a coaching or mentoring one-to-one session with our teams, and we do this on a weekly basis, we ask 4 key questions. The first question is, where are you winning? So we encourage them to think of the things that have gone well. Then the second part is, where are you challenged? Now, this becomes a good point for you to either bring up stuff, but hopefully they're self-aware enough to be the ones to bring it up themselves. So if something hasn't gone right when you ask, where are you challenged, then hopefully your team member will be the first person to say, well, actually last week, this thing didn't go so well. I wasn't able to meet this particular project within the deadline. But even if they don't, and you have to be the one to bring it up, at least they are expecting it, because they know that every week we're going to ask these same questions. And then that can begin a coaching conversation around how we can do those things better. Which moves us to then the third question, which is, what do you think you can do differently? So again, you're not telling them what to do yet. You're giving them agency, which is also a posture of servanthood, to say, you know what, I think you're a smart person.
Yeah.
So what do you think we can do differently for the next round? Get them to talk about it. And then fourthly, ask them, okay, so that sounds good. How can I support you in that? And that's the thing that allows us to be sometimes directive, to be corrective in our stance, but ultimately still show that we're there to care for them, to care for our teams.
So I completely agree with you, Leon. So, in our 8-step methodology, under the 6th step, which is called implementation, we talked about DMS. That means our staff, the team, must do it relentlessly. That's the first D. The M is monitor it continuously. That means on a weekly basis on Friday, you must have on a dashboard clear signs what doing well, what you call they're doing very well. They're all green color. Red is not doing so well. And partial means they are only doing it in yellow. And the S, the last part, is that solving problem recursively. That's where you do the coaching. To me, the best way to coach people and to mentor them is on the weekly cadence. We don't like to call it failure. We call it problem, because failure, when you put the word failure, it's associated always with admission.
Yeah.
You have guilt. There is an admission associated with it. But the moment you put it as a problem, you then define it rather differently. To me, a problem is a problem to be solved. And so everybody's involved in trying to solve the problem. So when you sit together with the person in the discussion, you are then taking a posture of asking the question, how can I help you to solve the problem? And you don't just ask the person, but during the problem solving, you really try to resolve it. The best way to mentor people is to bring it down to the real world. Don't talk theoretically about how to mentor somebody. A real problem that they encounter,
Yep.
that's the real thing that you talked about and that you demonstrate. If I was in your shoes, this is what I will do. And the reason why I think so is the following. You tell the guy, go and try it and let me know next week whether it works or not. And if it doesn't work, you come back to it again. Our methodology, we all say, if the guy cannot resolve it within 2 weeks, it gets escalated at you, as supervisor. So you can't pinpoint down to the person that has failed in doing it, because you now said after 2 weeks of trying to assist that guy and help, if he or she cannot solve it, you then have to become the person that solves it. In this way, you become a service to the employee, because then they realize that you're not just preaching on top of the mountain, because you yourself will come down from the mountain to try to resolve the problem yourself.
And even if, let's say you're in an organization and you have this kind of institutionalized system around problem solving, I mean, let's just face it, not every leader, not every manager is necessarily going to have this stance. There are a lot of people in the comments who often say, what you guys talk about, very, very ideal, but people are not always like that. And sure, there are many leaders. I think I've also been in positions where in the earlier part of my maybe leadership journey, maybe there were some self-serving tendencies in there. So, I mean, of course, that's the reality. We don't discount that. But I think that's the very reason why, in this case, problem solving is regimented in this sense. It's institutionalized. We have a system, an automatic escalation system, which forces managers, which forces leaders to engage in problem solving.
Right.
Because it's time-based. If the problem has not been solved by a certain time,
it gets escalated.
There's no choice. It just automatically gets escalated to you. And now it is your responsibility to be involved in that problem solving before it gets escalated to the next level.
Absolutely.
The one that you call the Inquisition.
Yeah. You see, most people have this issue. If you talk to anybody in the organization, people who are frustrated in the organization, they always point to the leadership. They say these guys are not doing their job. The problem the organization is because of leadership. They're not involved. They don't understand the problems we encounter. But once you institute the problem-solving mechanism with an automatic escalation, you show to them that everybody in the whole organization will become a servant leader in one way or another in solving problem of the organization because of the automatic escalation. So that means a failure to resolve the problem at one level will get escalated to the higher level. After 2 weeks, if they can't solve it, it gets escalated to the next manager, to the general manager, to the CEO. And so this way, you then realize that everybody is involved in what we call the X factor. It is true what you're saying, that a lot of people say that, well, this is the ideal. It's true. That's why we call it X factor. There are a lot of organizations that don't institute it. And if you don't institute it, you just pass the buck down the line and let those guys continue to have the criticism of top-level management. They're sitting in the ivory tower, shouting large messages, descending from heaven to tell us what we haven't done. But, they themselves are not stooping down from heaven to go and solve the problem. And so when you come close to giving the analogy, the concept of Jesus coming down to earth, when God has said, I will send my only son, begotten son, to come and die and be here on earth together and walk the earth with you, understand exactly what you have, what you encounter, and not only pay the ultimate price to die on the cross for the salvation of mankind. That's the ultimate example, in my view, of the X factor demonstration of servant leadership.
So we've talked about servant leadership in terms of leading and serving your immediate teams. Now let's talk about the next layer, which is servant leadership as service to a wider community. Now, if you're in a business, then this could mean your clients, it could mean your customers. If you're in a church, then this is perhaps your congregation. But even if you are in school, there are wider communities for you to be able to serve as well. So maybe talk to us a little bit about what does this kind of look like in your context?
Maybe I turn it a little bit further in the family. And I look at my father and your grandfather. He had the opportunity to succeed, my great-grandfather as the chief in that village, Batu Patung. But his father said, it's better that you don't do that. Why don't you go to school? Why don't you come back as a teacher? He said. And he told him, if you come back as a teacher rather than the chief, you will have a huge impact on our society and our kampong, he said. And my father was is actually from that village. He was the first person that went to school, and he had posted out. So he came back as a teacher, and he was a pioneer teacher in the community. And my dad was a teacher. He opened so many schools in the Kelabit Highlands, and he spent all his life in 35 years teaching kids. And that was the single biggest, in my view, other than our faith in Christianity, the single biggest thing that made huge impact on the Kelabit community. For a small population of less than 1,000 or 7,000 people, the total number of graduates from the Kelabit community is one of the highest in Malaysia, actually, as a per capita. And that was because of the folks like my dad, the early ones, the teachers who pioneered it and really put education on the pedestal, because he knew that was the biggest thing. Later in life, when he retired, then he fulfilled his father's wish that he became the chief of Barrio. He became the Penghulu and Pemanca. And Tama had always, my dad, has always been putting service ahead of himself. And I give you an example. At the later part, when he was teaching in Miri, he did something that was quite incredible. You know, the Penan, the nomadic people in Sarawak, many of them, they come to town when they're very, very sick. And they are put in hospital. When they die, many of them who died, they have no relatives, they have no friends there. And for some reason or other in the hospital, they knew my father was around, that he would care for these people. He would get a call from the hospital and say, there's a Penan here, an identified man, and he's just died. We don't know what to do with his body. And they called my dad. He would go to the hospital, pick the dead body of this Penan and put it in his car and drive and to find a place to go and bury him. And he would actually, Tama would make the coffin for the guy, find a place to bury him in the graveyard, and do that. There was absolutely no glory in what he was doing.
By the way, for context, the Penans are another tribe in Borneo. That they're a lot more, I guess, secluded. In the way that they live. So they don't have a lot of resources. I know, unlike maybe the Kelabits and other tribes. And I actually clearly remember, even as a kid, oftentimes if there were Penans traveling by, I remember there was a storm outside, and then I remember there was a man and his daughter sitting in the kitchen, and I was wondering who are these people? And I asked the Pupu'un, and then he explained to me that these are Penans, they're from a neighboring tribe, and they've been traveling, and because of the rain, I asked them to come and take shelter in our house. So that continued to happen even later in life as well, when I was in the picture, and I'll always remember that.
Yeah, my dad had this maroon color car that was there, and there's the joke that's going on among your cousins. You know, the cousins, when they sit in the back seat in the evening when Tama was my dad's driving the car, and somebody would point to the person in the night when he was driving it that the Penan was in the exact seat where you were there before, the dead Penan, the body. He used to put the dead body of the Penan in the back seat of the car, fully strapped. I mean, Tama was a very unusual man, so when he eventually died, relating the story, and I said it in some other episodes before, he had Alzheimer's. And then he told me and my siblings, my brother and my two sisters, to organize a party. He had a huge party, about 600 people. And he told everybody in his speech, I am relinquishing my job as the leader, as the Pemanca and the Penghulu, because I have this disease. It's called Alzheimer's. And I will die twice. The first time I will die mentally, and the second time I will die physically. But he said, if you have something positive to say to me, don't just wait until I'm mentally dead, because by the time you come, I wouldn't even remember you by name. And so let's just say right now, it was the most emotional party I've ever had in my life, actually. We all sang Amazing Grace. People were all in tears. But, he had the grace at that time to step down from his role as the leader because of this. And I looked at my dad. He said, look, the guy had spent so much of his life. I can tell you, my dad had spent 35 years as a leader. Not a single day did he take a sick leave in 35 years. Dedication of the man to serve the community. Then when he finished that, he retired. Then he became the chief in the Penghulu in the village. So continue to do that right up to the time he had Alzheimer's. He stepped down when he had Alzheimer's. He knew he just could not serve anymore in the community. He passed on the baton. I look at him as a man that clearly demonstrated to me the X factor in leadership, that he was serving the community to the best of his ability. And that was absolutely classic example. It's in our own home, Leon.
And, I think it's important to use the language of community, because I think if you are serving a vision that's bigger than yourself, you ultimately need to anchor it on something a bit more real and a bit more tangible. And these are the things that will keep you going, because the reality is you might have a great mission, but obviously the greater the mission, also the more challenge and the more resistance and hurdles that you'll face. So you need something to keep you going. And I think when you're anchored on ultimately community and on the people that will be part of that vision, those are the things that make the mission very real to you. And in this case, it was to use the example of Tepuk Po'un, my late grandfather, a real love for the community. That was the thing that was able to help him make maybe some slightly left field decisions. He could have very quickly climbed to the rank of village chief, which would have been seen as, wow, if you've got a fast track to do that, like why wouldn't you do that? But what he did instead was he said, let me take another path and let me actually serve the community on the ground by way of education, by building schools, teaching on the ground, which would then later become the reason to believe, if you like. Having served, having actually made an impact there, that then gives him margin for when he did eventually become the sort of head of the village, to be able to have a bit of weight to the things that he was saying, because he had already contributed to society, contributed to the community in that way. And so I think that's an important stance to take. And maybe just very quickly to close, if one is so bent on serving community, serving others, where then is the room to also look after yourself and also to care for your own immediate family? And these are questions that I'm asking myself as I sort of take on more responsibilities. Sometimes the easy thing to do is to give my best self for the other roles. And sometimes naturally in doing that, you come home as a slightly reduced version of yourself, just by virtue of being a bit more tired. So I've been thinking intentionally about how do I continue to show up for my family first and foremost, while also giving my best outside. What are some of your thoughts on this area?
The two things there, Leon. The first one is the why you do it needs to become very big for you. John Ruskin once said, the best reward for a person's toil is not what he gets out from it, but what he or she becomes of it. Because the idea of, if you pursue this service to others, service to the community, service as a mission, and in the process of doing that to the best of your ability, you will become transformed to become a very, very best version of yourself in leadership. That's a transformation. So that's the thing that that will be for yourself. But that regards your family, the sacrifice that is taken out there. It's easier said than done, but this is my second rule. The second rule is this word about being absolutely ruthless and focused about what moves the needle. The reason why we can't juggle many balls in the air is because we're not clear about the measure of true north in each of the things that we do. If we're clear about the true north, our priorities are then clear. So the word being ruthless, but what do not matter. What do not matter, please do not do them. And if you don't do them, then you have a lot of time that you are going to grant for others.
You had a very clear example of this, your time when you were at Malaysia Airlines. Can you share what was the thing that you were very ruthless about saying no
One
to?
of the things I was very ruthless about, I had more than 22,000 employees. I figured out if I accepted wedding invitation from the staff who were getting married and the children, I would practically have no weekends. So I made a rule for myself that any invitation from them, the answer is no. Because if I did that, then I would have no weekend for my family.
So it's not because he didn't like you, but because you were simply following a rule of life that you set for yourself.
And that is it's easier said than done. Some of you may remember, I talked in one of our episodes that your mom and I were taking the sabbatical. I took a sabbatical last year to discover for ourselves what is it that we can do jointly together in the second half of our life. And we've spent the whole 1 year looking for a few things. We're trialing a few things. We landed on one mission that we're going to focus on. And that is that we are jointly serving in some way or another, serving others for marriage. Because we realize there's so many busy people in the workplace, very busy executive and managers and CEOs. They have hardly time for their home and for their family and etc. That dealing with a conundrum is a very big challenge in today's world. During the sabbatical, we ourselves, we went through 2 sessions in Manila and another one in Singapore where we were exposed to the ideas and we felt that it was a calling for us. It's a mission that we can do together. And so we went into the marriage course ourselves, the Alpha marriage course, and we were taught by Nikki and Sheila and Lee. The 2 of them are real good example of what you can do. This fantastic example. So we learned from the very best, and we've now weaved it in our toolkit as well. Not only do we want to learn from them, we also want to learn from the HTBB Church folks. So we went and had a retreat as pure participant, listening to the whole process. So the original material come from Alpha Leadership that's designed and developed by the couple that I referred to, Nikki and Sheila Lee. But the local guys have adapted it to HTBB and how it will work. So your mom and I spent the whole time on retreat, learning as participants so that we understand one view that came from the original founders and how it was adapted for local circumstances here. And so we've now joined that mission. It's a mission that your mom and I are really now dedicating ourselves for the HTBB KL for the marriage course, because we realized it was such an important thing for us to be able to do together to the point, because the second point was, how do you deal with the conundrum, the competition, the conflict that deals with the workplace and the home for very busy executive, and how to keep the marriage in harmony. And this is a huge challenge for a lot of people, and that's why we're putting ourselves to become a part of the team that does this.
Yeah. And I think if there was one posture, one underlying posture to take, actually, if people are thinking, well, I'm not naturally like this, I think there's one thing that we can do, which is generally everything that we've talked about, it involves a dying to self. So we've talked about different sacrifices. We sacrifice ourselves for the sake of mission, people, community. At the end of the day, it's a level of sacrifice to die to oneself. And people might say this sounds a bit morbid, but actually I don't think it is, because when we die to self, what that means is that we take ourselves out of the equation and we start to put the people around ourselves first. And I think naturally, as you begin to develop this habit of asking, how can I serve the other? I think that will eventually start to manifest in the way that you talk to people, in the way that you lead people, in the way that you think about the impact of whatever results you're trying to go for in the workplace. Dying to self. But also some people might think, does that mean that I begin to diminish and reduce myself? This is something that I used to think as well. I used to think, well, maybe this dying to self language isn't very helpful, because if we're wanting to pursue the impossible, how can I pursue the impossible by showing up as a reduced version of myself? But over the years, I've realized that dying to oneself is not to reduce yourself.
Oh yeah, no.
But rather, there's this saying in church circles, And it's a prayer that you often hear people pray, where they say, God, less of me, more of you.
Yeah.
Which is true
Yeah.
to an extent. But I like to think of it this way. I like to actually think of it as, God, use all of me so that I can reflect more of you. Actually, in order sometimes for us to see more of God, that requires us to be able to increase our own capacity, to increase our capacity in order to serve the mission. As a Christian, in order that mission is, whatever the mission is, it's always ultimately to point back to God. And so dying to oneself is not simply diminishing yourself, but it's thinking about yourself a little less and thinking about what the greater purpose is, so that you might be able to increase your capacity, so that you might be able to serve your team, so that you might be able to serve the community, which will ultimately help to address that overall true north and that overall sense of mission.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dad, for today's chat. And thank you all for listening to yet another episode of The Game of Impossible. A lot of this was referencing an episode that we did the previous week with Tan Sri Jamila. So we highly encourage you to watch that one. That was episode 64. She's a great woman, truly inspiring story as well. But thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed conversations like this, we have episodes that go out every Friday at 6 a.m., both on YouTube as well as Spotify. We also have short form content on both TikTok and Instagram at The Game of Impossible. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all next week.